The focus of the collective rights for Francophones is focused on language rights. Now, officially in Canada, both Francophones, those are the people who speak French, and Anglophones, people who speak English, have the collective right for their two linguistic groups to have access to education and government services in their language. No other language group has that right. But usually when we think of collective rights, it's based on the need to protect the culture of a minority group. And Anglophones in Canada are the majority, especially here in Alberta. They don't need laws to protect their language, so we're just going to focus on Canadian Francophones. Most of the permanent early European settlements in Canada were French. The British preferred to move further south where the weather was warmer and it was easier to grow crops. Over time, more British people did arrive, and war after war kept the status of Canada as a British or a French colony in turmoil. It just kept going back and forth. This can best be seen in the example of the Acadians, who were among the first settlers to Canada in modern-day Nova Scotia. Being French colonists, they'd have to pledge allegiance to Britain when the Brits won the war, but then it would be returned to French rule when the French won a war, and this went back and forth. So by 1755, the Acadians were tired of this and refused to pledge allegiance to the British Crown. "We're Acadians," they said. "We'll be really good citizens, but we don't want to pledge allegiance to anyone but ourselves." Well, that was unacceptable to the British, who had many of the Acadians deported, splitting up families and seizing their property. So can you see how French colonists across the continent would be nervous about the British rule? In 1759, a small but very famous battle was fought on the Plains of Abraham in Quebec City. The reason this battle is important is because this was the last major battle fought for the control of Canada, and this time the British won. But the British were outnumbered by the French. They knew that the French wouldn't be happy about British rule in this area, and they were afraid war may start up again. They didn't know the battle on the Plains of Abraham was going to be the last one. In fact, the French colonists call this the conquest, being conquered. Nobody likes that. So the British government promised the French people that their language and their culture would be protected. Again, the idea of collective rights to protect a group. Now, even though the French were the majority, they didn't have political power, so that's why they needed the laws to protect them. After this, things were okay for a while, but as the number of English settlers began to increase, so did the requests to the government to end these collective rights. Why should the French be protected? They should assimilate into the mainstream culture. Does that sound kind of familiar? Like the comments being made about First Nations when the Indian Act was established? So, the government of Canada got rid of the collective rights, and for almost a century, Francophone Canadians were discriminated against. Remember that Riel resistance? We used to call it the Riel Rebellion because Louis Riel and his Métis government were rebelling against the Canadian government for not respecting their land or culture. But today, we say it's a resistance, that Riel was trying to protect his culture, his French Catholic ways, by resisting the government policies that threatened this. Later, when the Manitoba government closed the French Catholic schools, Francophone Canadians saw this as just yet another example of how they were being treated like second-class citizens. By the early 20th century, many businesses in Quebec would only allow Anglophones to hold important positions. Government services were not provided in French. Even at something like a hockey game, Francophone players and fans were treated like second-class citizens. By the 1960s, Francophones had had enough, especially those living in Quebec. They started what is known as the Quiet Revolution. Not because the people were quiet, but because there wasn't a lot of bloodshed like you see in some revolutions like today. Their slogan was "Maîtres chez nous," masters in our own house. Have you ever noticed a Quebec license plate? Je me souviens. This means I remember, meaning remember how we've been treated. Eventually, the federal government decided to hold a commission, which is a committee to research an important topic. The commission recommended that the government make Canada a bilingual country to recognize the importance of the Francophone culture in Canada, and to try and make up for the broken promises Canada had made way back in the 1700s. Later, when the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was passed, much of it outlined the rights that were due to the French people, including French language education. Not that having these rights necessarily meant that it was easy to enforce them. It took Francophone parents in Alberta a long time and a lot of political pressure before they convinced the government to support the creation of Francophone schools. In addition, these language rights can cause some conflicts. While Anglophones and Francophones have the right to receive government services and education in their languages, there is a loophole in the Charter that says provincial governments don't always have to follow the rules in the Charter. This meant that the government of Quebec could pass what is known as Bill 101, officially known as the Charter of the French Language. Essentially, this law makes French the official language of the province, and for a time it really banned the use of English in many circumstances. Today, there can be other languages on things like store signs, but French must still be predominant. Unlike the First Nations groups, who started to create political organizations to protect their collective rights, In Quebec, the citizens created political parties like the Parti Québécois and the Bloc Québécois. The focus of these parties was to ensure the protection of the French culture, even to the point of separation. So we call these separatist parties. Twice, Quebec has voted on separating from Canada. The last vote in 1995 was very close, 50.6 to 49.4. So now the Canadian government works very hard to keep the Quebecois happy. Growing up after the Quiet Revolution and here in Alberta, I often became annoyed with all of the attention the government was giving to Quebec. It seemed like so much money and time was being spent trying to keep Quebec happy. But then, as I've learned about our past, that we even thought about assimilating this group of people, I'm glad that we're now working to protect this part of Canada that makes us different from the US. Don't get me wrong, there's times when I think the government decisions are a big mistake, but when I go to Quebec City and enjoy the unique culture that's there, I'm really proud to be a Canadian. I'm glad we have special rights to protect minority groups.